So we're going to make bacon and Swiss cheese quiche. This is a really easy recipe. It does take some time to make because you have to make the dough for the crust, put it in the refrigerator, let it sit for about an hour, take it out, roll it out, put it in the pan, bake it, then you can mix your quiche ingredients and cook those. But it's worth every step of it because it's a really good recipe. So this is going to make a lot of noise because you have to use a food processor or a blender or something. Food processor is best because it will cut the butter up into pieces into your flour. There is another way to do it that I can tell you, and we'll talk about that as well. So in the food processor, I've already put 1 1/4 cups of plain flour, and that's just plain all-purpose flour. I'm going to add 1/4 teaspoon of salt and 7 tablespoons of butter that I've cut up into pieces. And then we're going to turn the food processor on, and while it's running, we're going to pour ice water into it. And it takes 1 to 2 tablespoons of ice water just until that dough starts to form a ball and pull away from the sides of the food processor. So you don't want it to be, it should be a fairly dry dough, just moist enough for those pieces to form a dough. So this is the part where it gets loud. Okay. So if you can see how it kind of all pulled over to this side and just formed a ball, then we're going to take that and dump it onto a piece of plastic wrap. Get that where you can see it. Make sure you have all of that dough. It's going to be sticky, but I do let the butter come to room temperature before I cut it and put it in here. So we're going to need to put it back in the refrigerator and let that kind of get back to a more solid state, and that's going to let us roll this out a whole lot easier. So we're going to wrap it up, kind of flatten it out into a disc. That'll make it easier when we take it out and start to roll it. Okay, and I'm going to leave it in the refrigerator for 30 minutes to an hour, and then we'll be right back. So the dough has been in the refrigerator for an hour, and I forgot to tell you an alternate way if you don't have a food processor. One thing you can do is use a pastry blender. If you've watched the video on how to make biscuits, I do use a pastry blender in that video. So there is a video that you can use to see how to use that. But you can use a pastry blender to cut the butter into the flour, and then just use a regular mixer, a KitchenAid mixer, or some other type of mixer. Even a fork would be fine at that point to just incorporate that water into it until your dough forms. So once you take this out of the refrigerator, it will be quite solid, so you may have to kind of flatten it out just a little bit more to get it warm enough to be able to work with a rolling pin. So I've rolled it out to approximately an 11-inch circle. This is not a perfect circle. People who bake and do that kind of stuff, I don't know how they do it, but mine don't turn out perfect. I've got this mat, this pastry mat that I use whenever I roll things out, which is not very often. So I usually forget where it's stored because I don't use it enough. But if you don't have one of those, they are great to have if you ever have to roll out dough for any reason. Keeps it from getting all over your countertop. And this one's Pampered Chef, and if you need one, I know a girl, if they still make them. So if you'll transfer it to your rolling pin to put it in your pan, in your plate, your pie plate, that's a little easier. The recipe calls for a 9-inch pie plate. I'll just put it in whichever one I have, it's big enough. And you can do the fancy edges. If you do an 11-inch crust, that's going to be more than enough. It's going to fold over the edges a lot. But you're going to press it down in your pan. You don't grease your pan or anything. You're just going to press that dough in to make sure you get it all the way into the corners along the bottom. And then you can trim it, or you can make a fancy pie crust, however it is you want to do it. Usually I just take a knife and go right along the edges and cut it off. And I'll come back and even it up anywhere that it's not even, like where the handles are on my pie plate. If I'm doing a pie, I will take the time to do a little fancier crust, but for this, it's not supposed to be fancy. So you just trim all that excess off. And if I'm not mistaken, this recipe might have actually come from Emerald years ago. Okay, so even it out just a bit. We're going to bake it. Get it golden brown. So I'll bake it at 375 for about 20 minutes. Let it get golden brown. Take it out. Let it cool a little bit because we're going to be putting cold ingredients into it, and we don't want that to affect our crust and our plate, to maybe break the glass on the plate by not tempering it. So we're going to go ahead and just let that cool a little bit before we mix up those cold ingredients. And I'm having trouble talking today. Maybe it's just this cold, rainy weather, I don't know. But we're going to mix all that up, pour it in here, and then bake it once we have the crust baked. So throw that in the oven for 20 minutes and we'll be right back. Okay, now our crust has been baked, and it doesn't get like a golden brown. It does brown some, but it doesn't turn like a golden brown. If it gets really, really, really brown, that's too much. So just cook it for the 20 minutes and then take it out, and the hot glass will continue to cook it just a little bit and it'll be perfect. So now we're ready for the other ingredients. I've got 6 slices of bacon that I've cooked and then chopped. You can chop it before you cook it. I think it's a whole lot easier to go ahead and just cook it while they're whole slices and then chop them after you've cooked them. And I don't chop them tiny. There are good sized chunks in here. But just whatever size bites you would want in your quiche. So that's what I've done. To that, I've got 2 eggs and 2 egg yolks that I'm going to beat just a little bit, and then add to the bacon. Those are really yellow. Okay. Then I'm going to add 1 1/4 cups of half and half. A 1/4 teaspoon of pepper. A 1/4 teaspoon of salt. 1 cup of grated Swiss cheese. And a pinch of nutmeg. And the nutmeg won't really be enough to taste unless you're looking for it, but it does kind of give it that finishing taste to it that you expect from quiche. Now we're going to mix that up. This is really, really simple to make. The crust is kind of the only part of it that's a pain, but other than that, it's a really simple recipe to make. Once you stir those together, you just pour them into your cooked pie crust. It is still a little bit warm. You don't have to let it cool completely. it's okay if your pan is still just a little bit warm. And that crust will shrink when it's cooked. So if you want to leave it just a little bit bigger when you trim it, you can do that. Spread the ingredients around. And now we're going to cook this at 375 for 30 minutes, and then you take it out and you let it sit for 15 minutes. And letting it sit for the 15 minutes is the hardest part because it looks so yummy. And quiche is one of those things that I can eat for breakfast, for brunch, for lunch, for supper, whatever. It's really good, so we like it any time of the day. So while this is cooking, I'll fix us a salad that's going to go with our dinner, but we'll cook it for 30 minutes, then we'll be right back. So the quiche cooked for 30 minutes at 375, and then I'll let it sit for 15 minutes. It'll come out all puffed up, but whenever you let it sit, it'll go back to normal, and it's ready to cut, ready to eat, and I hope you try it. Enjoy.